On August 15, 1945, the guns fell silent across the Pacific. Victory over Japan marked the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. In the skies above celebrating cities, formations of P-51 Mustangs, the legendary fighter that had helped win the air war over Europe and the Pacific, circled in triumph. These sleek, silver machines had escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, swept enemy fighters from the skies, and become symbols of American air power. But as the champagne flowed and ticker tape filled the streets, a troubling question emerged in the corridors of military planning: what would become of the thousands of Mustangs that had secured victory? The United States military found itself with an extraordinary surplus. More than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been produced during the war years, and thousands remained in operational condition. They represented billions of dollars in manufacturing investment, countless hours of engineering brilliance, and the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design. Yet the world they had been built to fight in no longer existed. The massive military-industrial complex that had sustained the war effort was rapidly contracting. Defense budgets faced severe cuts as millions of servicemen returned to civilian life, and the nation turned its attention toward peacetime prosperity. The P-51 Mustang was more than just another fighter aircraft. It had become legendary during the war, transforming from a troubled early design into the most effective long-range escort fighter of the conflict. With its laminar flow wing, powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and exceptional range, the Mustang had given Allied bombers the protection they desperately needed over the heart of Nazi Germany. Pilots spoke of the aircraft with reverence, praising its speed, handling, and reliability. It could fly farther, fight harder, and return home more consistently than nearly any other fighter in the sky. But war creates its own logic, and peace demands different calculations. The rapid advancement of aviation technology during World War II meant that even proven designs faced obsolescence. Jet engines promised speeds the Mustang could never achieve. The dawn of the atomic age suggested that future conflicts might be decided by different weapons entirely. Military planners looked at rows of P-51s sitting on airfields across America, Europe, and the Pacific, and they saw both an asset and a problem: thousands of capable aircraft in a world that might no longer need them. The fate of the P-51 Mustang after World War II would become one of the most fascinating stories in aviation history. These aircraft would not simply fade away into scrapyards and surplus lots, though many would meet that inglorious end. Instead, the Mustang would embark on a second career that would span decades and continents. They would serve new nations, fight in new wars, pioneer new uses for military aircraft, and eventually become treasured symbols of a vanished era. The story of where these fighters went reveals the complex intersection of military strategy, international politics, technological change, and human passion for flight. As 1945 turned to 1946, the Great Dispersal began. The decision about what to do with America's surplus fighters would shape not only the aircraft's legacy but also influence the balance of power in a world rapidly dividing into Cold War camps. The Mustang's journey was just beginning, and it would take these legendary fighters to places and purposes their designers could never have imagined. The immediate post-war period presented American military planners with a logistical challenge of staggering proportions. At the war's end, P-51 Mustangs were stationed at hundreds of bases across the globe, from England to Italy, from Australia to the Philippines, from Alaska to North Africa. The United States Army Air Forces, which would become the independent United States Air Force in 1947, had to decide quickly which aircraft to keep, which to store, and which to dispose of entirely. The decision would be driven by budget realities, strategic assessments, and the relentless march of technological progress. The first wave of demobilization was swift and ruthless. Thousands of aircraft were deemed surplus almost immediately. In Europe, where vast fleets of Mustangs had escorted bombing raids over Germany, entire squadrons were deactivated within months of victory. Rather than flying these aircraft back across the Atlantic, an expensive and logistically complex operation, military authorities made a controversial decision. Hundreds of P-51s were simply pushed into piles, bulldozed, and buried at European airfields, or sold for scrap to local dealers. The sight of these magnificent machines being destroyed shocked many pilots and ground crew who had depended on them for survival. But from a purely economic standpoint, the cost of shipping them home exceeded their perceived value in a peacetime military. In the Pacific theater, a similar process unfolded. Islands that had served as forward operating bases during the island-hopping campaign were littered with aircraft. Some P-51s were flown back to depots in Hawaii or California. Others were abandoned in place, left to corrode under tropical sun and salt air. On some remote atolls, Mustangs simply disappeared into the jungle, forgotten until decades later when aviation archaeologists would rediscover their rusting hulks. However, not all Mustangs faced immediate destruction. The newly forming United States Air Force retained several thousand P-51s in active service, recognizing that the transition to jet fighters would take years to complete. The Mustang, particularly the late-war P-51D and P-51H variants, remained highly capable aircraft. They were assigned to Air National Guard units across the country, providing reserve capability and allowing citizen airmen to maintain proficiency in high-performance fighters. Throughout the late 1940s, Mustangs continued to fly regular patrols and training missions from bases coast to coast. The Air Force also established massive storage facilities in the desert's southwest, where the dry climate would preserve aircraft for potential future use. At locations like Davis Mountain Air Force Base in Arizona, rows of carefully preserved Mustangs sat beneath the scorching sun, their engines pickled, their fuel systems drained, wrapped in protective coatings. These boneyards represented a strategic reserve, aircraft that could theoretically be returned to service if international tensions demanded it. Meanwhile, the State Department and military planners recognized that the P-51 could serve American strategic interests through foreign military assistance programs. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe and communist expansion threatened in Asia and Latin America, the United States sought to strengthen allied and friendly nations. Providing capable military equipment became a tool of diplomacy and containment strategy. The Mustang, proven in combat and available in large numbers, became an obvious choice for transfer to Allied air forces. The first major foreign recipient was the Chinese Nationalist Air Force, which received hundreds of P-51s to support their ongoing civil war against communist forces. These aircraft arrived as Chiang Kai-shek's government struggled to maintain control of mainland China. American advisors trained Chinese pilots on the Mustang, and the aircraft saw extensive combat in the late 1940s, though ultimately they could not prevent the communist victory in 1949. In Europe, several nations that had fought alongside the Allies received Mustangs through military aid programs. The Italian Air Force, rebuilding after switching sides during the war, acquired P-51s to form the core of its new fighter force. Sweden purchased surplus Mustangs to supplement their air defense capabilities during the early Cold War period. Switzerland, maintaining its traditional neutrality, also acquired P-51s for air defense. The Royal Canadian Air Force continued operating Mustangs well into the 1950s, using them for both fighter and reconnaissance roles. Latin American nations proved to be significant customers for surplus Mustangs. Countries like Guatemala, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Bolivia purchased or received these fighters through military assistance agreements. For many of these nations, the P-51 represented their first true modern fighter aircraft, a substantial leap forward in air power capability. The Mustang would serve in Latin American skies for decades, often in roles far removed from its original purpose. By the late 1940s, the global dispersal of the P-51 Mustang was well underway. What had been an exclusively American aircraft during World War II now wore the markings of dozens of nations. This international distribution would give the Mustang a second act that would extend far beyond its original wartime service, and in some cases, would see these legendary fighters return to combat under circumstances their original pilots could never have imagined. The assumption that the P-51 Mustang had finished its combat career proved premature. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, igniting a conflict that would once again call upon the legendary fighter. When the Korean War began, the United States Air Force was in the midst of transitioning to jet fighters. The F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet represented the future, but the harsh realities of combat in Korea revealed that the propeller-driven Mustangs still had vital roles to play. The terrain and conditions of the Korean peninsula favored certain capabilities that the P-51 possessed in abundance. Korea's mountainous landscape, primitive airfields, and close-quarters ground support missions created an environment where the Mustang's ruggedness, long loitering time, and precision at low altitude proved invaluable. While jet fighters excelled at high-altitude interception and speed, they consumed fuel rapidly and required longer, better-maintained runways. The Mustang could operate from rough forward airstrips, stay over the battlefield for extended periods, and deliver ordnance with devastating accuracy. The United States Air Force quickly recalled hundreds of P-51s from storage and National Guard units, rushing them back into combat service. Fighter-bomber squadrons equipped with Mustangs deployed to Korea, where they would fly thousands of sorties in support of ground forces. The South African Air Force also deployed a squadron of Mustangs to Korea as part of the United Nations coalition, marking one of the few times that Allied forces from multiple nations flew the type in combat together. In Korea, the Mustang proved its versatility in a new role. While it had been designed as an air superiority fighter and escort, in Korea it became primarily a ground attack platform. P-51 pilots flew close air support missions, attacking enemy troop concentrations, supply columns, artillery positions, and infrastructure targets. They strafed trains, destroyed bridges, and provided critical air support during desperate defensive battles like the Pusan Perimeter and the fighting retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. The aircraft's 650 caliber machine guns and ability to carry bombs and rockets made it a feared weapon from the perspective of North Korean and Chinese ground forces. However, the Korean War also exposed the Mustang's vulnerabilities in the jet age. When Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters entered the war in late 1950, the P-51 faced an opponent it could not match. The MiG-15 was faster, could climb higher, and possessed superior energy retention in combat. Several Mustangs were shot down by MiGs, and it became clear that propeller-driven fighters could no longer contest air superiority against modern jets. The Air Force increasingly restricted Mustang operations to areas where MiG interference was unlikely, and gradually replaced them with jet aircraft as the war progressed. Despite these limitations, the Mustangs served with distinction throughout the Korean War. Pilots praised its reliability, toughness, and ability to absorb battle damage and return home. The aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics also made it safer than early jets, which had higher accident rates and less reliable engines. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953, the P-51 had flown tens of thousands of combat sorties, proving that even a World War II design could remain relevant in a new type of conflict. Beyond Korea, other P-51 Mustangs were fighting in conflicts that attracted far less international attention. In China, the Nationalist Air Force continued operating Mustangs from their refuge on Taiwan, occasionally engaging in skirmishes with communist forces across the Taiwan Strait. In Latin America, Mustangs participated in various internal conflicts and regional tensions. The Dominican Republic used P-51s during civil disturbances. Costa Rica's brief military utilized Mustangs before abolishing its armed forces entirely in 1948. The Indonesian Air Force employed P-51 Mustangs during conflicts with the Netherlands over West New Guinea in the early 1960s. These aircraft, acquired from surplus stocks and other sources, represented significant air power in a region where modern fighters were scarce. The Mustang's range and payload capacity made it suitable for operations over the vast Indonesian archipelago. Perhaps most notably, several P-51s found themselves involved in the 1956 Suez Crisis, though not in direct combat roles. Various Middle Eastern air forces had acquired small numbers of Mustangs, and they remained in regional inventories during this tense period. Israel had operated a few P-51s in the late 1940s during their War of Independence, though by the mid-1950s they had largely transitioned to more modern types. The final combat use of P-51 Mustangs in any significant capacity occurred in Latin America during the 1960s. Several Central American nations continued operating these fighters in counterinsurgency roles, border patrols, and internal security missions. The Mustang's ability to operate from primitive airfields and deliver precision firepower made it useful in conflicts where sophisticated air defenses were absent. These twilight combat operations represented the last chapter of the Mustang as a weapon of war, decades after the aircraft had first entered service. By the mid-1960s, virtually all military operators had retired their Mustangs from combat roles. The aircraft that had helped win World War II and served again in Korea had finally been overtaken by progress. Jet fighters, helicopters, and guided weapons had transformed military aviation into something the Mustang's designers could scarcely have imagined. Yet even in retirement from military service, the P-51 Mustang's story was far from over. The aircraft would find new life in ways that ensured its legend would only grow stronger. As military forces around the world retired their P-51 Mustangs through the 1950s and into the 1960s, thousands of these aircraft became available on the civilian market. What followed was one of the most remarkable transformations in aviation history. The legendary fighter that had dominated the skies over Europe and served in Korea would become a centerpiece of air racing, a tool for record-setting flights, and ultimately one of the most sought-after warbirds in private ownership. The transition began in the late 1940s when the first surplus Mustangs became available to civilian buyers. The prices were astonishingly low by modern standards, often just a few $1,000s for an aircraft that had cost the government over $50,000 to build just years earlier. Early civilian buyers included aviation enthusiasts, former military pilots nostalgic for their wartime mounts, and entrepreneurs who saw potential in the aircraft's speed and capability. Some were purchased for conversion to executive transports, with the military equipment removed and passenger seats installed. Others were acquired specifically for air racing. Air racing had enjoyed popularity in the pre-war era, and it experienced a renaissance after World War II. The abundance of high-performance military surplus aircraft created opportunities for competition that had never existed before. The Cleveland National Air Races, restarted in 1946, quickly became dominated by modified P-51 Mustangs. Pilots and mechanics discovered that with careful modification, removing weight, streamlining the airframe, and tuning the engine, Mustangs could reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, sometimes faster. The National Championship Air Races in Reno, Nevada, which began in 1964, would become the premier venue for Mustang racing and would continue that tradition into the 21st century. The Unlimited class, featuring modified World War II fighters, became the headline attraction, and P-51 Mustangs consistently filled the starting grid. These aircraft, painted in spectacular color schemes and bearing names like Precious Metal Voodoo and Striga, became celebrities in their own right. Their Merlin engines, modified to produce far more power than originally designed, created a distinctive sound that became synonymous with air racing. Some racing Mustangs were extensively modified with clipped wings, redesigned canopies, and engine modifications that pushed horsepower well beyond 1,000. The quest for speed records also attracted Mustang owners. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, several pilots used P-51s to attempt transcontinental speed records and long-distance flights. While the Mustang's absolute top speed was eventually surpassed by jets, its combination of speed, range, and reliability made it attractive for certain record attempts, particularly those in categories restricted to piston-engine aircraft. Private ownership of Mustangs expanded dramatically during the 1960s and 1970s as the warbird movement gained momentum. Aviation enthusiasts began to recognize that these aircraft represented tangible connections to a pivotal moment in history. Organizations dedicated to preserving and flying historic aircraft emerged, and the P-51 became one of the most prized additions to any collection. The aircraft's relatively docile handling characteristics, at least compared to some other high-performance warbirds, made it accessible to skilled civilian pilots, though it still demanded respect and proficiency. The process of maintaining a P-51 in flying condition presented significant challenges. Original parts became increasingly scarce as the decades passed. Merlin engines, complex pieces of machinery requiring specialized knowledge, needed expert maintenance. The cost of operation was substantial. Fuel consumption, insurance, maintenance, and storage could easily run into tens of thousands of dollars annually. Yet despite these obstacles, the community of Mustang owners grew, bound together by shared passion and the thrill of keeping these historic machines flying. Some Mustangs underwent extensive restoration to return them to wartime configuration and appearance. Dedicated craftsmen spent thousands of hours stripping decades of modifications and corrosion, rebuilding engines, fabricating parts, and applying authentic markings. These restored aircraft became flying museums, appearing at air shows across the world where they educated new generations about World War II aviation and thrilled crowds with demonstration flights. The sight of a P-51 Mustang in flight, its Merlin engine roaring and its polished aluminum or olive-drab paint gleaming in the sunlight, became one of the most stirring spectacles in aviation. The growing value of P-51 Mustangs created an entire industry. Aircraft that had sold for a few $1,000s in the 1950s were worth tens of thousands by the 1970s and hundreds of thousands by the 1990s. By the early 21st century, pristine examples, particularly rare variants or aircraft with notable combat histories, could command prices reaching into the millions of dollars. This appreciation in value reflected both scarcity — many thousands had been scrapped or lost to accidents — and the growing recognition of the aircraft's historical significance. The Mustang's popularity in private hands also led to innovation in warbird maintenance and operation. Specialty companies emerged offering parts, restoration services, and maintenance expertise. Type clubs formed, bringing together Mustang owners to share knowledge and resources. Some organizations acquired multiple Mustangs, creating formation flight teams that performed at air shows, recreating the sight of wartime fighter formations. These displays served as living history, providing visceral connections to the past that no museum display or documentary film could fully replicate. Hollywood also discovered the appeal of the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft appeared in numerous films about World War II, from the major studio productions to smaller independent projects. Sometimes authentic Mustangs were used, other times, aircraft were modified to represent other types. The Mustang's graceful lines and powerful presence made it a natural star of aviation cinema, further cementing its place in popular culture. As the 20th century drew to a close and a new millennium began, the P-51 Mustang had completed a transformation from weapon of war to cherished artifact of history. The aircraft that military planners had once considered disposing of in bulk had become one of the most valued and carefully preserved examples of aviation heritage. The journey from surplus fighter to treasured warbird reflects broader changes in how societies remember and honor their past. Today, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive in various conditions around the world. Museums on every continent display these aircraft, preserving them as educational tools and memorials to the conflict that shaped the modern world. the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Royal Air Force Museum in Britain, and countless other institutions house Mustangs that tell the story of World War II air power. Some are displayed in flight configuration, suspended from ceilings as if frozen mid-mission. Others sit on pedestals, their panels open to reveal the complexity of the machinery within. Each preserved aircraft represents thousands of hours of manufacturing labor, the courage of the pilots who flew them, and the ingenuity of the engineers who designed them. Approximately 175 P-51 Mustangs remain in airworthy condition worldwide, a number that fluctuates as restorations are completed and, tragically, as accidents occasionally claim these irreplaceable machines. These flying examples represent the pinnacle of preservation effort. Maintaining a 75-year-old fighter aircraft in safe flying condition requires expertise, dedication, and substantial financial resources. Each flight hour demands meticulous inspection and maintenance. Original components are treasured and carefully maintained, while worn parts must be fabricated by specialists who possess increasingly rare skills. The warbird community has embraced the responsibility of stewardship. Organizations like the Commemorative Air Force, the Collins Foundation, and the Planes of Fame Air Museum operate flying Mustangs as educational platforms. These aircraft travel to air shows, where millions of people have the opportunity to see them perform, hear their distinctive sound, and connect with the history they represent. Pilots who fly these Mustangs undergo rigorous training and accept the responsibility of safely operating irreplaceable historical artifacts. Every flight is a balancing act between honoring history through demonstration and preserving these machines for future generations. The digital age has brought new dimensions to Mustang preservation. Detailed documentation projects have captured three-dimensional scans of existing aircraft, creating digital archives that could potentially allow for reproduction of parts, or even entire airframes, should techniques advance sufficiently. Video footage and photography have proliferated, ensuring that even if flying examples eventually become too valuable or fragile to risk in the air, future generations will have vivid records of what a P-51 Mustang looks like in flight. The stories of individual Mustangs have become the subject of intensive research. Aviation historians have traced the combat records of specific airframes, identifying which missions they flew, which pilots commanded them, and what became of them after the war. Some Mustangs have remarkably well-documented histories. Others remain mysterious, their service records lost to time and bureaucratic entropy. Each aircraft is unique, bearing the scars, modifications, and character acquired over decades of use. The P-51 Mustang has also maintained relevance in the simulation and gaming communities. Highly detailed computer models allow virtual pilots to experience something approximating the sensation of flying a Mustang, introducing new generations to this legendary aircraft. While these simulations can never fully replicate the experience of sitting in a real cockpit, they serve educational purposes and inspire interest in aviation history. The economic value of surviving Mustangs has created challenges for preservation. As prices have climbed into the millions of dollars for the finest examples, these aircraft have increasingly become investments as much as passion projects. Some critics worry that Mustangs are being purchased by collectors who rarely fly them, turning living history into static assets. Others argue that high values ensure that aircraft are meticulously maintained and preserved for the long term. The tension between flying these aircraft and preserving them remains unresolved and probably unresolvable. International efforts to recover lost Mustangs continue. Aircraft that were abandoned after World War II in remote locations occasionally surface. Some have been discovered in jungles, others pulled from beneath farmland where they crashed decades ago. Even heavily damaged wrecks have value, as they can provide parts for restoration projects or be rebuilt entirely. Each recovery is part archaeological expedition, part treasure hunt, and part historical research project. The cultural legacy of the P-51 Mustang extends beyond the aircraft themselves. The Mustang has become symbolic of American industrial might, technological innovation, and the citizen soldiers who flew them. It represents a specific moment in history when the United States mobilized its resources to confront existential threats. For many, the Mustang embodies values of courage, freedom, and sacrifice. Whether this symbolic weight is entirely fair to a machine that was, after all, simply a tool built for a specific purpose, is less important than the fact that the aircraft has acquired these meanings from millions of people. As decades pass and the generation that built, maintained, and flew these aircraft in combat continues to dwindle, the responsibility of remembering falls increasingly to the aircraft themselves and to those who preserve them. The P-51 Mustang, preserved in museums and kept flying by dedicated enthusiasts, serves as a tangible link to a world that seems increasingly distant. When a restored Mustang roars overhead at an air show, its polished metal gleaming and its Merlin engine singing, it creates a moment of connection across time. For a few seconds, the present touches the past. The question of where the P-51 Mustang went after World War II has a complex answer. It went to dozens of countries and fought in multiple conflicts. It went to civilian owners who raced it and cherished it. It went to museums where it educates and inspires. Most importantly, it went from being an expendable weapon produced in wartime urgency to being a priceless artifact of cultural heritage. The aircraft that military planners once buried in foreign soil or sold for scrap now commands prices and devotion that those same planners would find incomprehensible. The Mustang's journey from wartime necessity to peacetime legend represents one of the most remarkable second acts in aviation history, ensuring that this legendary fighter's story will continue to captivate future generations.